Morning. I'd like to start off by talking about a little pet peeve that I have when we study the Bible, because as a whole, the churches of Christ don't tend to study the whole Bible. We generally pick and choose, mainly from the New Testament. We'll study the Gospels, Acts, a few of Paul's letters, and we really like James. But when we get to the Old Testament, occasionally Genesis and Exodus, sometimes Job. I've only ever heard 2 lessons that were on a minor prophet that wasn't Jonah. We don't study most of the Old Testament. And this is honestly something that we should do more often, because the Old Testament has been preserved for a reason. God saved it for us so that we could learn from it. And so everything in the Old Testament is something that we need to be able to learn from, something that we need to study so that we can know why God wanted us to have that. It also poses the dilemma of how do we take lessons from this without making it about us? So we have to remember that the Old Testament is history. It's not a parable that Jesus is telling. It's not a letter that Paul wrote specifically for a church to grow. It's a story that actually happened. So how do we balance between learning from history but remembering that it is factual history? This morning I want to look at the book of Ecclesiastes, that is, by and large, one of the most overlooked books of the Old Testament. It's not quite as overlooked as the Minor Prophets, but we don't study Ecclesiastes very often. And today we're going to specifically look at Ecclesiastes chapter 2, because in chapter 2 we hear a story that should sound familiar to a lot of us. Before we get into that, we're going to look a little bit at the background of Ecclesiastes. It was written most likely by King Solomon. There's a little bit of debate on that, but pretty much everyone agrees Ecclesiastes was written by King Solomon, who also wrote some of the Psalms, all of the Proverbs, Song of Solomon. It was written during a time in his life after he'd become king when he was looking for something to give his life meaning. It's a journey that I'm sure we're all familiar with, trying to find something in life that we enjoy, something that we want to do. And it shows him searching for a lot of places to find this fulfillment in life, and it shows him failing in a lot of places to find this fulfillment. He looks to certain areas that we're going to talk about, but no matter where he looks, he just can't find that fulfillment that he needs. He just can't find something that gives his life purpose. And overall, the lesson of Ecclesiastes is about the futility of putting our lives into anything other than God. It's about the futility of finding fulfillment, say that 5 times fast, in anything that's not God. Because in the end, our fulfillment comes from God. The purpose of our life is worshiping God. Now, before we really get into Ecclesiastes, there's one other thing we have to talk about, and that's the phrase, a striving after wind. It's a really common phrase throughout the book of Ecclesiastes, especially in the first 2 chapters. A striving after wind is something that Solomon writes after he's failed to find fulfillment in something. After he's tried something and it didn't work, it didn't give him the joy that he looked for, and he says, all this is like a striving after wind. And the idea there, and I don't speak Hebrew, but I've been told by people who do that it's a lot more clear and a lot more meaningful in the original language. But the idea behind it is finding fulfillment in something else is like chasing a breeze. You're never going to be able to get your hands on it. You can try all you want, but finding fulfillment outside of God is like trying to grab a breeze. And so, as Solomon looks for this, we get this image of him standing out in a field, just chasing down every breeze that comes by, trying to grab hold of it, while God is just looking on, wanting Solomon to look to him. So with that groundwork laid, let's go ahead and dive into the text of Ecclesiastes chapter 2. We'll start with the text that was read a few minutes ago, verses 9 through 11. Ecclesiastes 2, verses 9 through 11 reads, "So I became great and surpassed all who were before me in Jerusalem. Also my wisdom remained with me, and whatever my eyes desired I did not keep from them. I kept my heart from no pleasure, for my heart found pleasure in all my toil, and this was my reward for all my toil. Then I considered all that my hands had done, and the toil I had expended in doing it, and behold, all was vanity, and a striving after wind, and there was nothing to be gained under the sun. Another common phrase that you hear throughout Ecclesiastes is the word vanity. The very beginning, vanity of vanity, cries the preacher, all is vanity. The preacher referring to King Solomon, the writer of Ecclesiastes. So we see Ecclesiastes 2 begins with Solomon looking for his purpose in self-indulgence. He looks for fulfillment in all the things that he can have. This should be a very common story to those of us living in America, because we live in a consumer culture where we want anything, and only things make us happy. There's a common stereotype about America that it's a very shallow country, that we don't care about anything below the surface. We just want to have the things that make us happy. And in a lot of ways, that is the culture that we have. Now, I'm a bit of a patriot, so I want to look past that and say that America has redeeming factors. But at the end of the day, we live in a culture that's all about the stuff that we can have. The American dream is coming from somewhere where you have nothing and working your way up the ladder to having everything. The American dream is all about getting stuff. But America's not alone in that. Every culture throughout history has had this desire for things. Sure, it's not always been as prominent as it is today, but King Solomon said himself, anything his heart desired, he didn't keep from it. King Solomon begins this passage by saying, "So I became great and surpassed all who were before me in Jerusalem." This isn't just him talking. He truly did become greater than any king before him. Granted, there were only two at this point, Saul and David, but Solomon was greater than either of them had ever been. He was wiser than either of them. He was richer than either of them. He had something that we would definitely frown on today, and God frowned on back then, just to be clear, 700 wives and 300 concubines. Solomon had a lot of stuff, and there was nothing that he could have, or nothing that he wanted that he couldn't have. It was like the entire world was his candy store. He could take anything that he wanted, and it still didn't make him happy. You see, a common criticism of America is that it's based on the stuff, and the reason that people criticize us for that is because the stuff doesn't make us happy. It might make you happy for a few days. Getting something new that you didn't have before might make you happy for a bit, but eventually your life is just going to go back to normal, and you're going to have a little bit more stuff and just be as unhappy as you always were. It's something that in psychology we call the hedonic treadmill. Something might make you happy for a little bit, but you're always just going to go back to where you were. It's like walking on a treadmill. No matter how much you walk, you're always in the same place. And so Solomon talks about how he'd got all of these things, surpassed everyone else, had everything he ever wanted, and it meant nothing. It was, as he says, all was vanity and a striving after wind, trying to find your fulfillment in the possessions that you own, and self-indulgence is like trying to grab a breeze. Fulfillment doesn't come from the stuff we have. Going back to psychology for a second, in case any of you didn't know, I am a psychology major at Freed-Hardeman, psychology and youth ministry double major. So generally when I talk, I have that psychological viewpoint behind it. Everyone who's ever been in a psychology class has heard of Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It begins with the physical needs that we have: food, water, air, the things that we physically cannot live without. And it goes up into different areas of needs. After that, it's security needs. The need to be safe, the need to be secure, the reason that I lock my doors every night before I go to sleep. We all want to feel secure. But as you go up the hierarchy of needs, they get more difficult to find. And what I always thought was amazing is the very top of the pyramid, at least when Maslow designed it, the very top of the pyramid was something that we call self-actualization. And it's the idea that you are truly fulfilled when you know the purpose of your life and can live happily with anything. For a lot of people, we call it finding your calling. True happiness comes not from all the things that we have. The things are the bottom of the pyramid. The things that we need, the food and water and all of those stuff, that's just how we stay alive. But true fulfillment, according to Maslow, comes from finding our calling and chasing it down. Having everything you want might make you happy for a few days, but it's never going to last. And we've actually changed the pyramid since then so that there's a step even above that, which is helping other people find their calling. But at the end of the day, Maslow and Solomon are making the same point. Stuff doesn't make you happy. Stuff doesn't help you find fulfillment in life. And trying to find fulfillment from that stuff is like trying, in modern language, to grab a breeze. So Solomon takes a different route. After he realizes that none of the stuff can make him happy, he goes to a different area of life. The next passage will be from Ecclesiastes 2, verses 15 through 17. Verses 15 through 17. Then I said in my heart, what happens to the fool will happen to me also. Why then have I been so very wise? And I said in my heart that this also is vanity. For the wise as of the foolish there is no enduring remembrance, seeing that in the days to come all will have been long forgotten. How the wise dies just like the fool, so I hated life, because what is done under the sun was grievous to me, for all is vanity and a striving after wind. After Solomon realizes that he can't find fulfillment in the things that he has, he turns to a different area of life. He tries to find his fulfillment in his wisdom. This makes sense as Solomon wrote most of the book of Proverbs, which is all about wisdom. Theme verse of the book of Proverbs, Proverbs 1, verse 7, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Proverbs is all about finding wisdom. And so Solomon, when he realizes that the stuff won't make him happy, he turns to wisdom. This is a path that, again, is very common in today's culture, that we try to find our fulfillment through all the things that we know. We try to find our fulfillment through education, through learning more. A lot of people will get degrees that they don't need for the job just so that they can say they have that degree. Now, I can't talk too much about this because I am a youth ministry major and I'm getting a bachelor's degree in it, but I know people who have doctorate degrees in divinology, which is, for most people, the highest degree you can get in biblical studies. It's called a D.Div for many people. They have doctorate degrees in that, and I've met people on the street who understand the Bible better than they do. Because the education doesn't really make you more qualified than anyone else. Now, I think that we should study the Bible. It's important. It's necessary. Like I said, I am majoring in youth ministry and learning about the Bible, but you don't have to have a degree in Bible to understand the Bible. And the same is true about any degree. Degrees don't make you a more fulfilled person. Having a degree, having a doctorate degree, a master's degree, any degree, none of it gives us the fulfillment that we look for in life. And a lot of people go down that route. They try to put all of their life into education, into academia. People who will go off to Harvard and smack talk anyone who hasn't gone to an Ivy League college. And at the end of the day, we're all going to have the same size gravestone, no matter where we went to college. And that's the point that Solomon's making here. It doesn't matter how wise he is, he's going to die just like everyone else. The most foolish man in the world and the wisest man in the world are both going to die, and chances are neither of them will be remembered that long. And so, for people who try so hard to put their fulfillment into education, people who try so hard to get their fulfillment out of the things that they know, the things that they can learn, at the end of the day, it's pointless, because they're going to be remembered just as much as people who don't know anything. Now, again, I'm in college. Clearly, I think education is important. But my parents always told me growing up, I can go off and be a doctor or I can be a garbage man. As long as I'm doing it for God, they're still going to be proud of me. And yes, you can be a garbage man for God. I knew a mailman once who spent every day reading the Bible while he was out. He was listening to it through audiobooks, things like that. And he would listen to the Bible while he was out driving. And whenever he came across people, he would stop and talk to them about the Bible on his mail route. And I've known preachers who are only in it for the money. So I've known mailmen who are better preachers than preachers are. And I'm sure all of you know people like that too, who don't have a job that many would consider to be a spiritual job, but they sure turned it into an evangelism opportunity. Education doesn't mean anything in the long run. And in fact, again, there is a scientific basis behind this, because high intelligence, due to some studies that we've found, high intelligence is generally linked with higher rates of depression. I don't like talking about this stuff very often because it kind of gets into very depressing places, and it's, church is supposed to be a happy time. It's supposed to be a time where we're worshiping God, but high IQ is linked to a lot of different issues: bipolar disorders, mood disorders, anxiety, ADHD, autism spectrum disorders, even autoimmune diseases. Things that are purely physical are linked to having high intelligence. So at the end of the day, being the smartest person in the room doesn't mean you're the most valuable person in the room. Trying to find your fulfillment in education is like trying to grab a breeze while it passes by. And then Solomon turns to the final area, at least in this chapter, in Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verses 24 through 26. Verses 24 through 26, it reads, "There is nothing better for a person than that he should eat and drink and find enjoyment in his toil. This also I saw is from the hand of God. For apart from him who can eat or who can have enjoyment, for to the one who pleases him God has given wisdom and knowledge and joy, but to the sinner he has given the business of gathering and collecting, only to give to one who pleases God. This also is vanity and a striving after wind." So Solomon decides, I haven't been able to find fulfillment in the things that I have. I haven't been able to find fulfillment in all the wisdom that God has blessed me with, so maybe I can find my fulfillment in a job, in work, in doing something with my hands. He describes it as toil. We would probably describe it as being a workaholic. A lot of people fall into this trap too. As we'll find going through the book of Ecclesiastes, this is a biography for a lot of us. Because how many of us haven't tried to put our faith, our fulfillment into something that falls into one of these three categories before? For a lot of time growing up, I fell into the education category. I tried to put my worth into how much I knew, only to realize that it was just as pointless. And so, when self-indulgence and when wisdom fail, Solomon throws himself into his job. And for a lot of people, that is what we see. They can't find any joy in the things they have. They can't find any joy in their wisdom. And so they're going to throw themselves into their job. They're going to spend all day thinking about it. They're going to spend their entire life trying to get better at their job, trying to find some fulfillment in it. And just like the other two, that just doesn't work. Workaholic is a word that is kind of difficult to define. A lot of us would call it people addicted to their jobs, but it's hard to quantify that. But workaholics have shown higher rates of a lot of physical issues. Alcoholism, sleeping problems, heart disease, depression, weight gain, blood pressure, and an inability to maintain intimate relationships with any close friends or romantic partners. At the end of the day, throwing yourself into your work is just as bad as throwing yourself into anything else, because you're going to end up with a lot of these problems. And so Solomon finds out that as he's trying to throw himself into toil, it's just as pointless as the other two. And at this point, you guys are probably wondering what you got yourself into letting me speak. This has been such a depressing sermon. We're just talking about all the issues that people have when they're smart or when they do a lot of work. Well, As often is the case in the Bible, there's the dark side of it, but there's also the bright side of it. The Bible's all about that duality between good and evil, between light and darkness. And none of what we find when we read through this passage is none of the three things Solomon talked about are necessarily bad. It's not evil to have things. It's not evil to have objects that we own. I own a phone that I'm using for notes right now, a laptop that I use in the youth class for PowerPoints. I own a recliner at the dorm that I use when I want to take a nap because the beds are not comfortable. It's not evil to own things. It's not evil to know things, to have wisdom. Many would describe Jesus himself as being an incredibly wise person. Rightfully so. Jesus, at the age of 12, was on the level of the teachers in the temple. It's not wrong to have wisdom, and it's not wrong to have a job and to enjoy your job. When Adam and Eve were in the Garden of Eden, literal paradise on earth, God gave them a job. Adam's first job was to name every animal on earth. And after that, their job was to take care of the garden. It's not evil to have a job. None of the things we've talked about are bad in and of themselves. The issue comes in when we put those things above God. In fact, all of Proverbs is about how important it is to have wisdom. How can we read Proverbs that's all about having wisdom, then read Ecclesiastes that says wisdom is pointless? And then we go back to the theme verse of Proverbs when we remember the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, the beginning of understanding, some translations say. None of the things we've talked about are bad on their own. They become bad when we put them above God. When we take our self-indulgence and the things that we want, and that becomes more important than serving God. The rich young ruler in the New Testament is a great example because he had done everything else right, and when Jesus told him to sell his possessions, he went away sorrowful because his possessions were more important to him than following Jesus. There's nothing wrong with being wise, but when we get so caught up in how wise we are that we stop being humble about it and stop putting God first, that's when it becomes a problem. There's nothing wrong with taking our job seriously. God wants us to take our job seriously. Everything you do in word or deed, do all in the name of the Lord. God wants us to take our job seriously, but when that job becomes more important than God, that's when it goes too far. When we're spending more time thinking about that job than we are praying and reading the Bible, and when, hey, I know emergencies come up and sometimes we have to go do something for work, but when we are missing church every week because we're so caught up in our job, that's when it goes too far. There's nothing wrong with having joy in other things, but fulfillment, that comes from Jesus. That comes from God, and that's the message at the end of Ecclesiastes, because what Solomon finally finds out in, I believe, chapter 9 of Ecclesiastes is that his fulfillment comes from the blessings that God has given him. His fulfillment comes from worshiping God, from praising the Father. And that's exactly where our fulfillment should come from. Anything else that we try to chase down, anything else we try to find our fulfillment in is pointless. It's like chasing a breeze because our fulfillment comes from God. We bear the name Church of Christ because we are the church devoted to following Jesus. We're the church married to Jesus. He is the head, we're the body. Our fulfillment doesn't come from any of those other things. Our fulfillment comes from praising God. And it's really easy to forget that sometimes. It's really easy to get so caught up in other things that we forget our lives are supposed to be devoted to Jesus. I'm sure we've all gotten caught up in other things and forgotten about Jesus. I know I do it far more often than I should. I get so caught up in schoolwork that I forget to take time and read my Bible and pray and just thank God for everything that He's given us. And so my challenge this morning is for all of us to re-examine our lives, to look at our lives and look at the things we prioritize and see if there's anything that we're putting over Jesus. Is there anything that we're trying to find fulfillment in outside of God? Because if so, we have to put that down. If there's something that we're putting above God, we have to reprioritize and put that where it's supposed to be and let God have the throne of our hearts where He's supposed to be. Like I said, there's nothing wrong with having things. Nothing wrong with being wise. Nothing wrong with loving your job. But all of that should come primarily from our love for God. Because if we are trying to find our fulfillment in anything else, it's just as pointless as trying to chase a breeze. And so this morning, if you think about your life and realize that your fulfillment isn't found in God, no better time to make the change than right now. There is no reason that any of us should leave this building this morning still having something else in the first place of our lives. There's no reason for any of us to go home without God on the throne of our hearts. So if there is anything that we can help you with, whether you just need prayers for help in your life or whether you need someone to talk to you and to be there for you, that's what God gave us this family for. And so as you think about your life and the things you're prioritizing, if there's anything that we can help you with, please come forward and make that known as we stand and sing.